right, let's begin. Welcome. Thank you for coming. This is going to be, I'm excited for the panel here. Just an amazing group of panelists. We're going to be talking today about psychedelics, about medicine versus mysticism. So we're in this time today where psychedelics are being approved for medical purposes. MDMA, we're expecting approval this year. Psilocybin, the primary active ingredient in mushrooms, is going to be following shortly. LSD, this whole medical model has really sprung to life over the past few years. And at the same time, decriminalization advocates are making huge progress. Citywide, statewide, we're seeing similar patterns as with cannabis legalization. This way of accessing psychedelics that's more about recreation or religion, mysticism, or just creativity. And so we're at an interesting time right now when psychedelics are about to be scaled up. We're about to see psychedelic access at scale. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We have on the panel here visionaries, the biggest picture thinkers in psychedelics. So we're going to talk about what does the world's relationship with psychedelics look like in 2030, in the next 5 years. How are people accessing psychedelic medicine? So to introduce the panel, first I'll start with some panel drama. So you might notice here on the agenda just a short time ago we lost one of our panelists. So William Leonard Pickard was going to be on the panel here, and Leonard is famous for a number of reasons. One, when he was at Harvard and UCLA, he was the guy who sounded the alarm on fentanyl. He warned us it was coming, and apparently we really did not listen. 70,000 people a year now are dying from the fentanyl epidemic. And so he's famous, one, for that. Famous, two, also because the United States government alleges that he used to manufacture most of the world's LSD. And so he had been in maximum security prison for that crime for a couple decades, has been out now for quite a while, and on parole. But at the last minute here, the federal government decided that he would not be permitted to speak. So they are concerned about what he might say, what he might reveal. So unfortunately, he is not with us today, but he asked us to send his love and say hello to all of you. And so we will miss Leonard very much, but we have an amazing group of panelists here, each one of whom could take the entire hour, I think, to talk about psychedelics. But I'm Dillan DiNardo. I'm the founder and CEO of Mind State Design Labs, a next-generation psychedelic drug development company. So I will be your moderator here. We have on the panel Vince Kadlubek, who is the founder and the director of Meow Wolf. So Meow Wolf, in my mind, is the thing that started immersive art, almost the wave of immersive art in this country, at least. If you've never been to one of the installations in Denver and Santa Fe and a number of locations around the country, they are psychedelic experiences on their own. And Vince has been a leading voice in the way that psychedelics inspire creativity and bring the imagination to work. So we're very privileged to have him on the panel today. We also have Neşe Devenot. Neşe is, in my mind, perhaps our greatest hope in psychedelics for not committing the mistakes of the 60s, or mistakes that are even worse as psychedelics head to mass adoption. So Neşe is a senior lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, has a very long list of publications, of psychedelic associations and projects, which I won't go through now, but she has been a leading voice in calling attention to many of the risks, the harms, the things that people are ignoring as psychedelics scale up, and the things that could derail the entire process, the things that could lead to the dark side of psychedelics really defining the future here. So we're very fortunate to have you, Neşe. And then last but not least, we have Zach Leary. So Zach is an expert on psychedelic facilitation, the host of the MAPS podcast, a Bhakti yoga practitioner, an IFS expert. So many many skill sets there, but Zach has been deeply in the psychedelic space for decades. So it turned out the guy you were tossing the ball with in the backyard growing up, you came to realize that was Tim Leary, the guy who maybe started it all, made the 60s happen. And so Zach has had a front row seat here, deep relationships with many of the people who made psychedelics happen. His spiritual mentor was Ram Dass, and so we're going to benefit from Zach's perspective here. And I think I want to start there if I can. If I can ask you, Zach, to tell us how we got here in this moment where psychedelics have become the hottest thing in mental health. They're about to be approved. You have the similar trajectory of the decriminalization space. But this thing has deep, deep roots. And often people don't have a full grasp of how we got here. So can you just give the highest level overview you can of what happened and how we got to where we are today?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Good to see everyone. Thanks for coming today. And I'm honored to be with these guys. And really quickly, though, regarding Leonard, the way that you preface Leonard not being here, but if there's any reason for not being allowed to speak at a panel, that is what a tremendous honor, right? The government not allowing you to show up. I mean, you know you're doing something right, if that's the case, right? That's kind of how we got here, actually, right? It's, psychedelics were one of the great cultural disruptors of the 20th century, and so much so that the Nixon administration saw it as the tremendous threat that it was, because it empowered individuality, it empowered critical thinking, it empowered social justice, it empowered the environmental movement, it empowered the anti-war movement, and if there's ever a greater threat to the establishment, it's being able to think for yourself and to question authority. And psychedelics are an amazing, in the words of Stan Groff, a non-specific amplifier that can really do those things, But in answer to the question, I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. When psychedelics first started being used, I think in a formal, structured sense, the first kind of introduction to psychedelics that we saw in the West was actually in a therapeutic setting. And if you look at the 1950s use of psychedelics, guys like Oz Janiger or Humphrey Osmond, it was to aid in psychotherapeutic settings. And, there was some tremendous potential in that. There were some kind of semi-formal, semi-anecdotal studies with the reduction of alcoholism. Bill W. saw it as possibly a cure for alcoholism after his 6 LSD trips. But, we often say that, it is often said that, well, psychedelics leaked from the laboratory and made it into the counterculture, and thus the downfall began. I don't see it that way. I see it leaking from the laboratory and making it into the counterculture as one of the great steps in human evolution. And with that, sure, there was a lot of misuse in the 60s. There's no question about it. I think the reason for that is there were so few instruction manuals to go by, It's been told to me that from 1967 to 1969, on any given weekend, that there were 1 million Americans using LSD. And there were only 2 or 3 books out there. Aldous Huxley's, Doors to Perception. I wouldn't really call it a manual, but it's semi-manual. There was a psychedelic experience. But, education, harm reduction, set and setting, they weren't ubiquitous kind of terms that we kind of use today. So with the misuse in combination with the anti-authoritarian, think for yourself kind of properties of psychedelics, it created a perfect storm that forced them to go underground. And I don't think that's due to any one person or any one mistake. I think it was just a perfect storm that was too big. And it going underground created the need for the psychedelic community to really kind of lick their wounds, go back and regroup. And I think there are a lot of, in relationship to how we got here, there's a lot of organizations and people and individuals who kind of saw that the forest through the trees was a very, very long, slow, patient, methodical road to getting psychedelics back to a place of social acceptance and very specific uses like we're seeing in mental health today. And with that came the need for a lot of, for whatever reason, we could spend hours talking about it, but America is a very data-driven society. We like numbers. The scientific method has far more credibility in this country, for better or for worse, than, say, indigenous practices do. So we needed data. We needed proof. And that was a very long, long road to do that. We're talking about the MDMA becoming a legal therapeutic drug for PTSD. that was a 30-year odyssey that MAPS was on, But one thing that when I get asked this question, that's a really important thing to remember is, psychedelics and mental health and psychedelics-assisted therapy. But as it relates to mental health, I think a lot of people who are maybe newer to the movement forget that that is a very new application for psychedelics. When I grew up, and yeah, I'm proud of the way I grew up and the people I was surrounded by, we weren't talking about using XYZ to treat XYZ at all. That was not part of the gestalt. That was not part of what we were talking about. That was not even on the horizon to talk about using psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression or using MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. The basic use was it was a spiritual method. It was a self-expression method. It was a creativity tool. It was a tool to get you closer to God in whatever form God looks like to you. So I think that's a really important thing worth mentioning is really understanding the need and kind of keeping the flame lit that mysticism, self-expression, self-identification, self-reinvention is still a core part of the psychedelic experience, even if you're using it for a mental health application. Because I think if you're coming through it, if you go into it for one reason, you're coming through it for another. There are many great examples to talk about, in the juxtaposition of mental health and why that created a kind of a tidal wave of acceptance, vets, first responders, high efficacy rates, data research, things like that. But, so when I get asked the question, like Dillan asked, am I in team medicalized or team mysticism? I'm kind of on both. Had you asked me 20 years ago, I was much more of a anarchist zealot, but now I really see the need and have a tremendous respect for the need for a slower, more deliberate, research-driven kind of protocol to not make the same mistakes that we did in the 60s.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, and Neşe, I wonder if I can ask you to pick up on that thread. So the medical strategy, it was, for better or worse, a very crafty political decision to take psychedelics in that direction. And there's a certain hope that advocates of the FDA-approved therapeutics model have for the effect that might have, the positive effect it might have in psychedelic acceptance. And I wonder if you can, you have been just one of the most insightful and incisive and poignant commentators on the dark side of the things we might be missing in that model. But I wonder if you could start out here by steel manning that view, the advocates of FDA-approved therapeutics. What are they? What are we trying to accomplish with that particular strategy? And what's the story and what's the goal? Can you steel man that for us?
Yeah, thanks, and thank you all for being here. I hear a lot. There's a lot of different versions of what psychedelics are and how they work, but a common metaphor that's rolled out by a lot of advocates is the notion that a lot of our mental health issues, although they might appear different on the surface, are connected in the sense that we have habituated ourselves to ruminative and otherwise entrenched patterns of cognition, emotion, and thought. And so by the thinking goes, by disrupting your ordinary habits of how your cognition is functioning, you're able to create opportunities to do things differently than what had happened through habit and inertia. So the metaphor that's commonly used is like a ski slope, where there's a mountain and lots of people have been skiing, and the skis over time wind in grooves that tend to pull the skis into the pre-worn paths. And so people say by kind of shaking the snow globe, of laying down another blanket of snow and disrupting those grooves, there's more space to lay down new ways down the mountain. That is a kind of basic thinking. And then there's, things like PTSD. Part of the issue is not just that you want to have new paths, but the symptoms of PTSD create defenses and blocks to being able to address the root cause of those problems. And so by shifting and creating more capacity to engage with your mind and your body in new ways, the hope is that people can be empowered to move into a more healthy orientation that's not limited by accidents that happened in the past, for example. And I think that there's a lot of potential there. And I wouldn't be here if I had not been personally healed in multiple profound ways. I was charitably, quite a basket case growing up. I had debilitating social anxiety, debilitating obsessive compulsive disorder, didn't know what was wrong with me because that's all that I knew, and was really disconnected from myself and from people, social communication, that sort of thing. And then without any expectation of what psychedelics were, or having not heard a thing about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, I accidentally, accepted something when I was 18 in college, took LSD, and my life was changed forever. And the fact that I'm able to now travel around the world and stand up and talk about psychedelics in front of big audiences is itself a reflection of how profoundly psychedelics have changed my life. And honestly, when I went into this field, I wanted to study trip reports. I wanted to study how language, as I'm friends with Leonard Picard, how language to communicate not just testimonies of these strange, magnificent experiences that we come across with psychedelics, you have to use non-ordinary language to communicate what it feels like to be in those states. And there have been moments where I've read Leonard Picard. I've read Alan Watts's The Joyous Cosmology, which that's my go-to short book I recommend everyone read. It's really awesome because there are moments in that book where I read it and I'm like, I know exactly what he's talking about there. And I've never been able to put that into words, but he did it. And I know what that feels like, and you can get that sense of it. That's what I want to be doing with my time. Unfortunately, having worked in this field since 2010 and being a non-male, being less powerful, having a higher voice, not looking like the people who have the control of the resources in this space, I've seen some concerning things. And so I've needed to become a voice about the more critical, concerning risk side, not because I don't love psychedelics, it's because I love psychedelics, and I think they're so important that we need to get this right.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's get right back to that. I want to first bring Vince in and talk about his perspective as well. So this viewpoint that is so compelling that Neşe was talking about, the way that psychedelics as a therapeutic can have such a profound impact on various mental health disorders and otherwise. It's almost become the dominant narrative. It's the thing you see in the headlines. Psychedelics are the next generation of mental health disorders. Treatments for mental health disorders. And Vince, you've been someone who is talking about the kind of the true root of psychedelics and what psychedelics do and the connection between psychedelics and the imagination. So when you think about this question of are psychedelics medicine or are psychedelics more of a tool for mysticism and creativity, do you find yourself landing in one camp or the other, or how do you think about what it is that psychedelics do and are going to do to society as more people gain access?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And good friends with Leonard, and I'm sad that he couldn't be here today. He lives in Santa Fe. I also live in Santa Fe and had the pleasure of getting to know Leonard over the last couple of years. And so thanks for having me. I feel a little bit of an outsider here. I'm not in the field of psychedelics directly, though Meow Wolf is a very psychedelic experience and has been absolutely inspired by psychedelic substance over the years, not surprisingly. And me personally, obviously, LSD and psilocybin and bufo alveris and NDMT, these are all been incredibly valuable to me in reconciling some of my own insecurities and being able to move into a more future-based way of being rather than defining who I am based on the past. And so I am not who I have been, I am who I am becoming. And at the heart of that is where creativity also lies, where that term creativity, to create. It's also where mysticism lies. It just turns out that like creativity and creator are very similar terms, and it's also where mental health, I believe, exists as well, where the mental health, the positive attributes exist as well, which is that I have the choice to define my future. And I'm freed of the things that I have defined myself by, and I now have the ability to create anew for myself going forward. So to me, these things are actually like the same conversation. Creativity, mental health, mysticism, relationship to God. It's all in one's ability to tap into their creator, their creative self, and have choices that build a new self, I guess, So in the conversation, I guess, about, and I'm just really interested more so to like move on because like you stopped on a very important note, and I want to hear more. So, but I'll just say, like in the FDA versus decrim, if it was one or the other, absolutely decrim. But in a world where it's not going to be one or the other, yeah, both, for sure, one leading to the other. I think that actually the conversation's not that interesting, FDA versus decrim, as interesting as it is to have us all as individuals who are part of this movement and community to educate ourselves on harm reduction, to educate ourselves on how to facilitate positive setting for the people around us, how to call out people who are not informed about dosages, harm reduction, setting, how to really start to organically from the ground up, because that's how it's going to go. Whether it's FDA or decrim, no matter how this goes, it's going to be about leadership in individual communities, understanding best practices. Some of them might go through some form of therapy training and get certified, get accredited. Most won't. But we all today in this room have the ability to learn what has a long lineage. We're not making this up. It's like deep, long-standing cultural traditions that, and just ways of being as humans, listening, talking, having care, showing love, that can really help our movement and the proliferation of psychedelic use can really help that no matter what the government decides to do, And I think that in talking with Leonard before I came and kind of talking to him a little bit about this panel, Leonard, I said, well, what's the thing that you would stand for the most in this conversation? He said, the importance of community. That at the end of the day, that's the thing that should not be forgotten here. No matter how you get access to the substance, it's the significance of the community that you're, that you're facilitating. So,
yeah, let's talk about community. So, let's come back to the trajectory of decriminalization, but what's happening right now, what seems very, what's next, what's urgent is this medical model, this model in which you go to a place where there's a doctor, there is a therapist, there is an authority figure who is your access to these kinds of experiences, these kinds of medicines and these things that you were talking about. And that's not the same as a community. And so Neşe, maybe you can start us off here, but certainly I'd love for everyone to chip in. What goes wrong when you have that type of model as opposed to a very organic community of friends and neighbors who come together in community? What goes wrong in that medical model and that approach?
Yeah, I'm all for like a proliferation of experiments and studies and experiments understood broadly as not just scientific experiments, but just community experiments, artistic experiments. Like I think we should be exploring what psychedelics are able to do. And I'm of the opinion, taking this non-specific amplifier concept that Zach Leary introduced, I'm of the opinion that the way that we talk about psychedelics influences the types of tools that they can be. And so there's potentially a huge range of applications, but there's a real push to limit and restrict what they are, what we think that they do, and who gets to decide. And it's that constraint that I'm concerned about. And especially because the biggest harms that I'm seeing in the psychedelic space in general are interpersonal harms. It is profoundly dangerous to have a huge power imbalance, especially when you are not engaging with red flags about who is seeking out those positions of power, who wants to be in the room with highly vulnerable, traumatized people. It's not always the best of intentioned people. And we don't currently have where the discourse of the field is at is not prepared to distinguish, because people feel like they have good intentions, they want this like global net zero trauma, global spiritualization of humanity, we're all on board, and then they don't take a moment to look around and question what it is that they're so convinced that they have to move towards. Because there's a big play by certain powerful organizations, figures in this field, to say, we need to get this right. This is our chance. We have to all stay in line and not draw untoward attention to what it is that's potentially going wrong in this field, because this is so important. And I reject that completely. If psychedelics are that important, we can't be cutting corners. We can't be justifying people getting hurt along the way because someone, a powerful friend of powerful people in the space, they don't want to disrupt those kinds of relationships. Like, I think we need to be very intentional about what it is that we think we're doing here. And I keep hearing this, we needed this medical model and we have to kind of like bow down and praise the people who allowed medicalization to come through. And I completely reject that. I do not for a minute believe that psychedelics would have just went away. Psychedelics are here, and they're here to stay. And they are that awesome that we did not need this specific medical model to reauthorize. And I really want to challenge that point, because I hear it all the time. And no, my friends, psychedelics are too cool to have just gone away. Yeah. And I really feel that this power imbalance, and it's precisely right now, it's the people who are putting out the shingles who I'm most concerned about being in those rooms. Not that all of the people in the space are, but it's like systemically, because I think on a kind of systems level, I'm neurodivergent. I kind of think several steps ahead, partially a reflection of my OCD potentially, but either way, I'm thinking about when you scale these kinds of systems, you're creating pipelines to channel the most vulnerable people in society with the least power into the hands of people who don't have a lot of checks and balances right now. And I would feel better about that if, as a field, the people in charge were willing to step up and say very clearly, we're not going to accept abuse. We're not going to name Ben Sessa as a great leader at South by Southwest right after he admitted to sleeping with a patient who then killed themselves. We're going to say, we're not going to stand for that. And the fact that that's not happening does not give me a lot of confidence in the current people who are building this model.
Yeah, hard to follow that. I agree with everything that you said. And two things I wanted to say in reference to the medicalized model. One, that like when I hear it talked about, and this also applies to the decrim model as well, is that we're giving far too much of our power over to some government-led stamp of approval. You know, the government doesn't lead, it follows. You know, so the fact that the FDA or whoever, whatever body is going to approve whatever it is, to me, that's not that huge a win for me, really, in the sense that, like, you know, their stamp of approval really doesn't mean that much to me personally as a psychonaut. You know, I understand how it does in some mental health communities, but as a psychonaut, as somebody who likes to think that I'm on my own personal hero's journey to discover, to keep reinventing myself and discovering myself over and over and over and over again, and exploring all the different parts of myself, and, you know, upgrading my psycho-spiritual vessel, that, you know, psychedelics are, you know, our spirit molecule, are a gift left from God for us to do that. And who approves of it and who doesn't really doesn't concern me at all. And second, you know, this is perhaps a little bit of a utopian pipe dream, but in relationship to what Neşe was talking about in terms of bad actors and the psychedelic assisted therapy / underground facilitation, doesn't really matter, underground, licensed or not. You know, my kind of ultimate vision for what it is that makes a really effective guide, trip sitter, therapist in the psychedelic space is somebody who is completely dismantling the power structures between therapist and client. In a traditional therapeutic relationship, right, you go to see your CBT therapist or your IFS therapist or your couples therapist, you know, we give them some sort of power. We're paying them for that hour and have some sort of, even though we might be kind of chummy with them, it's like, hey, they're the expert on this, and I'm paying them to take me through this because they are experts in whatever it is I'm going through, right? And there already is this inherent power imbalance. In the psychedelic relationship, in my estimation and opinion and experience, the only authority in the room is the experience itself, is the experience that the medicine is giving to the voyager. Anything else is a fucking distraction. Anything else is a fucking distraction, you know? Any agenda, any sort of trying to steer the person to have their ultimate reality or whatever, you know, under the medicine, or any, you know, and on an extreme level, you know, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, you know, all of those things, and trying to build little kind of cult power structures out of it, those are all distractions. The medicine is inherently intelligent and will guide the person there. And, you know, as a facilitator, I strive to do it. I don't always succeed, but I just try to create the best conditions possible to let the medicine speak for myself and for me to step out of the way.
So let me play devil's advocate here and pose a question to the entire panel. So there are certainly ways that things can go wrong with psychedelics, where providing some power to a responsible individual or institution perhaps has the potential to mitigate those harms. So I think of recent stories in the news, the Alaska Airlines pilot who had experienced long-term dissociation after a psychedelic trip, and the disaster that could have become, Matthew Perry and his unfortunate accidents where ketamine was involved. So we do, if we were to say, okay, put the psychedelics in the vending machines, empower the community, empower the people, something goes wrong still at scale as these things are adopted at scale. So what would you propose? What model that is a bulwark against the abuses of the people in authority would you build in order to kind of find the bridge between those two sides, the risks on either end?
Well, I just want to emphasize as like a way into that, the healing experiences that I mentioned at the outset were all only experiences with friends. Experiences with friends is being marginalized, and there's a lot of people, the people who are putting out shingles, I've even seen people say, bad trips happen because you didn't program your intentions correctly. Pay me the low price of $599.99 and I will fine-tune your trip experience. And there is this psychedelic guiding industrial complex that is pushing this narrative that you can't trust yourself, you can't trust your community, you have to trust the people who are putting out the shingle. And I reject that. I think that we are completely missing out in that conversation on the reality that having community-based mutual aid support where people who are already in relationship, who already care about each other, have history, showing up for each other, being able to support one another, knowing exactly which favorite comfy sweater is in which drawer, where the favorite mug is, what the favorite music is, how to read when that person is overstimulated or needing to have, some kind of arm on the shoulder. If you are with people who you love and trust already, I am way more comfortable with that on average compared to the people who are self-identifying as spiritual figures that you have to pay in order to access these experiences.
100%, 100%. And that's why I'm incredibly weary of people, in the last 5 years, I've seen it especially, people who are newer to this method, who are under wherever they got the idea. I mean, I think there are a lot of pathways we can examine to where they somehow got the idea that this is a medicalized clinical experience that they're about to go under. Yeah, I'm not really sure entirely who's the culprit for that, but there seems to be this tremendous misunderstanding amongst people who are newer to the community that this is a clinical treatment and that this is a clinical experience. Therefore, what Neşe just said, all the different levels of power structures where, my entire introduction to psychedelics were, my 3 or 4 best friends, in the world growing up, Granted, we had some pretty good tutors over our shoulders, but for the most part, we were there for each other, and held each other through the darkness and through the light. And, those experiences are still the most foundational experiences of my life. And I can't imagine anything more cold and sterile and somewhat inducive to a challenging trip than going into, a sterile doctor's office and taking 5 grams of psilocybin with a guy in a white lab coat hovering over me. That doesn't sound all that fun to me,
It's the exact environment that we try to avoid. Yeah. It's the exact environment that causes bad trips. Yeah, when you ask about which model, what model are you proposing? I think maybe we're all saying something similar here, which is a cultural model. And cultures are built, like this has been a subculture, it's becoming a little bit more of a mainstream culture. Culture is built by leadership, and leadership that is well-educated and has developed a language and a shared language that's like and ritual and practice. That's like, those are defining elements of culture. And so it's actually like everyone in this room has the potential to become educated, to respect those who have come before us. It's amazing to me how many people in this movement don't know or care who Leonard Picard is. Like, spent 20 years of his life in prison on 2 life sentences, didn't even think he would be out, luckily is. Like, sacrificed his life. How many people have done LSD? How many people have done LSD and it changed their life? Like, how many times have we had fun on that substance or had incredible connection with other humans on that substance? And here's somebody who sacrificed their life to be able to have, for me to be able to, access it when I was 19 and have it change my life. And yet, we don't even honor the like work of the whole movement of people, 1950s and onward, who lost their jobs, lost all their credibility, you know, were imprisoned, were blacklisted. And there's this whole movement of younger people who it's like, let's start there culturally, understanding where this comes from, understanding our past, respecting the elders, respecting those who came before us. And then that goes even farther back from the 50s. I mean, that also goes into indigenous practices and educating yourself and understanding the lineage and the practices. And so yeah, the cultural. I've been trying to think about like a comp in this, like this industry versus like what's another example. And there's a couple I think about. Like either way, even if it is like FDA heavily regulated or whatever, we're still gonna. The psychedelics are here. Like we're still gonna be able to get. You know, are you gonna try to get a prescription for your psilocybin, or are you gonna just get it from the same person you've been getting it from for the last 20 years? You know, ultimately what's going to happen is that there's going to be, hopefully, an organic cultural understanding of best practices. And so a good example might be like the outdoor industry. Like, don't go into the wilderness alone if you've never been in the wilderness before. Plus, it's also a lot more fun to go with other people, especially someone who's been there before. Like, we don't have to worry about the government controlling our outdoor experience in the wild. You know, we bring our tent, we bring our water, we know what we have to do, we know what happens if there's like, fresh bear shit on the ground, we know there's probably a bear in the area. Like, we have an understanding of the environment, and that's largely a culturally based thing. There's no one forcing you into this. And it becomes common sense at some point. And so yeah, that's one. Another one I was thinking about is like just basic vacations. Like, yeah, the Bahamas is cool. Going by yourself kind of sucks. Better to go with friends. Maybe you don't want to do that like weird ass tour guide from that cheesy ass tour guide person in the Bahamas, because you're just going to research it yourself and be able to like figure it out with you and your friends how to best go about it. You know, like that's more the comparable to me here. Anyway.
I just want to follow up on that because the outdoors metaphor, or the model for thinking about psychedelics, I think is so important. And just we're at a phase right now. Many years ago, I had this trip experience where I was thinking about, and even like him, it was like at this poetic line: maps is just the excuse, and the real important work is the psychedelic community finding each other, and then we can discard this increasingly desiccated, problematic, old boys club, medicalized, paternalistic approach in favor of more options. And specifically the outdoors thing, I've been thinking about analogies to diving. So free diving is when you hold your breath and you go really deep and you try to push yourself to see if you can break records. Unfortunately, it's a little bit dangerous. You come back up, you black out, you can altered state from lack of oxygen. And so oftentimes, free divers who are especially trying to hit records, they have safety support divers. Do you know who the safety support divers are? They're free divers from the free diving community. Yeah. They're not some spiritual guru that you can, is above you and separate. It's people who have a lot of experience. Yeah. They're not going deep at the same time as you. They're watching you, looking out for red flags that you might be getting a little bit loopy and you might need to be, attended to. They're able to help you come back into your breath, and once they bring you up, if you're a little spooked because you went unconscious, they're able to help ground you. And they're not this special separate cast of priest leaders. And so I think this kind of approach is completely, it's like the elephant in the room with a lot of these powerful guys who would love to have a lot of money right now, but I feel like that there's other things that we can do and talk about. The other diving analogy I like to refer to, and this relates to Leonard Picard and the Shulgins and psychedelic literature, is cave diving, because cave diving also really dangerous. You're going underground, with water. You can't just come straight up. And there have been ritualized implementations of solutions to problems that past cave divers have run into. Like, oh, you go deep into the cave and you don't know which way that the exit is. So, oh, you put a line down. But now there's branching caves and you have a line coming off of it, but then you don't remember which way back to the surface of the cave. You end up accidentally going deeper. And so they started making these cookie, like, arrow clips that then they would, every time you take a line off the main line and you put a arrow so you don't have to think about it. You implement, you ritualize protective measures. And we come across some of these protective measures in community, in psychedelic literature, too. And the Shulgins are a great example, because one anecdote I love to refer to is they would measure sometimes like a booster dose ahead of time. And you know why? Because people had tried to measure a booster dose an hour into a drug experience, and they weren't able to get measure it into the little thing and time it correctly, so you do it ahead of time. And the more people share these best practices, the less likely you run into these kinds of problems.
Yeah, and just to add to the metaphor pile here, the Sherpas who guide people up big mountains, the Sherpas are locals. They're not spiritual masters of any kind. They're locals, and they will be the first to tell you that the conditions aren't right today. Don't go up. When the conditions are right, they'll take you, step by step by step, and kind of show you the way to go. I think that's a really another good example. Yeah.
I want to leave some time for questions here from the audience. Do we have a separate microphone? Are we? Perfect. Yeah, we line up over here if you have a question. I think I might summarize by saying the wave of the medical model is coming. It's kind of inevitable, but it's what I'm hearing is that it's this round peg in a square hole. That there are risks, there are ways that it's just going to run up against the wall. There are dark sides, and there's a bigger wave coming. Because there is a model that works. There's a community model that works, and that's where things are going, and that's the big wave, and that's where we're ultimately ending up.
It's also just the community model is just so much more pleasant of experience. It's just funner and more loving and more enjoyable. There's better music. There's better lighting. There's better communications, better conversations. Like you have you're going to have a choice at some point to do psychedelic substances however you want. The medical model is going to suck.
And just as a quick thing on that too, like with the community approach, it's also like when I've had friends who have like given me a hand or a cover or a glass of water right when I needed it, it's such a bonding experience. Like we are able to fortify community relationships by providing and caring for one another in this way, and they are trying to literally take that from us. Like that should just be the default, and you can go play your medical, experiment games, but not at the expense of pretending that the emperor's clothes are the only version of what's out there.
Thank you. Well, let's take some questions, please.
Hi there. I'm Tim Howling. I'm a firefighter, and psychedelics saved my life. Awesome. And now my wife and I run a nonprofit where we send first responders to retreats to experience the medicine and help with PTSD. And one of our core values is, as a student of history myself, is the role of indigenous people and the knowledge keepers. And I haven't heard a lot of that in this panel about the role of indigenous people in providing the medicine in the future. And for us, it's a very important thing. It's part of our culture. And I'd like to know what you guys think about the role of indigenous people as providers in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think our indigenous wisdom keepers, are vital to not only experiencing the medicine, but also passing on their knowledge. Because I think one of the great kind of colonizer kind of arrogance, kind of hallmarks of science is the scientific method, is discounting anything that predates the scientific method, which includes indigenous use. You see so many psychedelic quote unquote experts who, there's not a single thing mentioned about indigenous use. So even if you're not, I don't necessarily believe every psychedelic experience needs to happen with indigenous culture. But if you are newer to the community or older, like research them, talk to shamans, talk to curanderos, read their books, read their tales, listen, because those wisdom portals are some of the great ones that we need. Yeah. And thanks for again, I mean, I think your population has helped move the needle just in such an amazing way. So thank you. Yeah.
This may be a little bit of a controversial thing to say, but I feel honest in saying it, and I'd love to hear others. But like, it's also though inherently just to be weary of giving up authority wholesale, like even in this movement, because I think that like what I've witnessed is that there's a lot of I wouldn't even call it direct appropriation, though sometimes there is direct appropriation, or a lot of times there's direct appropriation. But even sometimes there's like actual training and lineage from indigenous practices that then is used as a cover for power. And then that power is used in problematic ways. Like some of the folks that I've, just in my broader community, I've seen go down really troubling paths with psychedelics. It has been within ceremonial usages that are very controlled and very like giving themselves up to the power of a guide that does come from some form of indigenous training, but is like still caught up in their own ego around it. And it's a really interesting kind of byproduct of it. And there's some really obvious ones where it's like you're not a shaman and you're pretending to be. But there's also ones that are gray area where it's like you trained under a shaman and now you're just caught up in your own very, very cult, what we see from cult leaders often, which is like heart's in the right place, people start following you, you start to get an ego about it, and now you're doing harm to the people who are following. So I've mentioned indigenous practices and a couple times up here, so I'm just saying, like, just generally, I think, like, there's deeper things that we all hold that are based in how to interact with each other in a loving and safe and respectful way that I think is, like, most important here is just how we as humans treat each other, So, anyway, I just wanted to add that part.
Well, just to quickly say, I mean, I think that genuine indigenous relationality requires dismantling capitalism and preventing there from being a system where we are funneling wealth from the top to feed the egomaniacs at the top of society who are our new philosopher kings. That is real relationality with these indigenous groups, to empower all of us to attend to and care for our communities, actual reparations, actual addressing these root causes. In practice, the way indigenous reciprocity is named, I see it being misused, because guess who is going to claim, who's going to staff their boards with indigenous folks? Who's going to emphasize their indigenous lineage? Some genuine people, but precisely these powerful people. And there's no critical nuance in the discourse in the field right now. It is just defer, don't question, while leaving the underlying problems intact. So it's a really important conversation, but I feel like it needs to go beyond that superficial level where it can be misused.
Yeah, great question. Central
I just want
question.
to say one more thing, just to be very clear though here too. There is a huge lack and gap in, like, a huge lack of BIPOC folks in these conversations, and that fundamentally needs to be shifted. Like, fundamentally. I mean, every psychedelic conference you go to, this is an issue. It's brought up all the time, and that's an issue in so many different places in our society. But this conversation specifically is like, it's shocking how much of a gap there is there, considering that this is historically where so many of these practices come from. And so and I'm part of the problem too. It's like, I'm not even of the psychedelic community. Like, I started an arts organization, and now I'm getting invited to psychedelic conferences to speak. And I'm saying yes because I love the conversation, but it's like, I'm a white dude who's not even part of the field, but I'm now being asked to be here, So
That's good.
I'll just mention quickly that I'm indigenous Kurdish. So the Kurds in Turkey are like the Native Americans in this country. Like it's a similar kind of dynamic. And the fact that I came from intergenerational mental illness exacerbated by post-traumatic stress, that I got to a place where I've been able to contribute at the level that I have, you would think that the psychedelics field would lift me up and support me. But I'm here on this stage today in spite of the psychedelics field. It's because my work is so good and different from what other people are saying that I have managed to survive against a lot of resistance. And the fact that, all these powerful groups are saying indigenous, like I was here before most people who work in the field were in the field. I was there in the early days. There was an article in an Australian newspaper that had a color photograph of me because when I wrote Coming Out of the Psychedelic Closet, people were still afraid to say that they had had psychedelic experiences. But my experience was so powerful that I felt it was important to name it and to encourage other people to do it. So they're writing an article about it, and they couldn't find anyone in Australia to put their picture on the article. So they had to reach out to me. So the fact that I've been here doing this work and this is how I've been treated, to me, really highlights, I don't mention it because I'm bitter. I mention it because what does that say about the field's actual motivations?
Thank you. Let's get to a next question here.
Hey, thanks for the panel. Really resonate with a lot of what you said, Neşe, and Vince, it's good to see you. It's been a long time. I have a question that I came in late because there's a lot to see and do here, so I was at another panel. So if you already talked about this, maybe you can just tell me to sit down. But I personally, having been a little front row to what happened with Meow Wolf, have a curiosity about if you have words of wisdom. Again, I'm part of the problem. I'm part of corporate psychedelic. But, just that loss of utopia and that push to grow really fast. And when Meow Wolf had to build so many sites so fast in the way that it, kind of had some ripples within the organization. And I just wonder if there's any lessons learned.
Yeah, gosh. Trying to kind of see how this... Yeah, I think that where this correlates to the scaling or growth of any movement or any organization or any industry, going back to what we're talking about, we've been talking about, is the importance of community leadership. And within the context of Meow Wolf, I think that we haven't or didn't cultivate micro community leadership within the organization, and really be able to recognize what that leadership looks like. And it's not about a job title, and it's not about where you're at in an organization or how much you're getting paid, and to be able to recognize that and value it and honor it. And so it was it was scaling with an ignoring of the significance of culture, I think, the significance of community, and it's happy to say that the vast majority of people who, started Meow Wolf back in 2016 are still employed, which is great. And happy, there's so many good things, there's great things, but now we're in the process of rebuilding the culture rather than having a focus on it at the onset of the growth.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have the worst allergies right now, so I sound disgusting. I wanted to get some perspective on closing the gap. So the context for this is I am a survivor of suicide watch and I have CPTSD, and my life was saved by corporate ketamine, full stop. My life was saved by psychedelics. And then after that, I ended up doing what I called rent a friend, and I had to go hire somebody to take me on a psilocybin journey. So I'm relatively new to this space. I'm less than a year in. And I do appreciate the nice, heartwarming idea of we should just keep this in the community, the music better, the lighting's better, fuck the man. That sounds really nice until you're somebody like me who does not have anybody in this space, doesn't know where to source safely, doesn't have anybody who knows how to safely take me on a trip, doesn't have any friends. I'm very visible in what I do. I'm an entrepreneur. I can't just go on... what am I going to do? Go on Reddit and be like, hey, who's doing psychedelics and is also a responsible functioning adult? I do understand what you're saying, and I know that it feels good. And God, man, I wish I had that. If anybody wants to be my friend, please let me know, because I don't have a psychedelic community. That sounds great. But corporate ketamine got me off suicide watch. Renting a friend for $7,000 that week, that's how much it cost me to go to Jamaica and hire a psychotherapist to take me on a psilocybin journey. There's still value in that because it did save my life, because some of us don't have the community that you guys have spent years building. So my question for you is this. For people like me, how do we bridge that gap and make that community widely available? Because it certainly wasn't available to me. I didn't even know it existed, number one. And number two, now that I'm doing my own journey, how do I safely source? Because it's not like I can put up an Instagram post and say, hey, who's got non-fentanyl MDMA? Or anybody can hit me with some with that, PRL. I can't. It's not realistic. So how do you close the gap between safety and community for people like me coming into this space who don't already have it?
Well, I mean, I for one, your question is a very, very fair question, and speaking for myself, as much as I want to sort of rebuke systems and different levels of access, whether it's through the government or corporations or whatever, it's not throwing a baby out with the bathwater proposition at all. Many, especially in people with high levels of trauma, not everybody's qualified to facilitate for you. It takes a very nuanced skill set to be able to sit for you properly. And yes, can be a tremendous need for a very skilled facilitator, and 100%. And I'm so glad that corporate ketamine saved your life. And I am glad that your experience in Jamaica also helped save to your life. I'm just not glad that you had to go to Jamaica to do it. That's the rub there.
And just to speak to that real quick, I realize that comes from a place of privilege.
Yeah,
because I can afford $7,000 to rent a friend.
Totally.
In Jamaica.
Yeah.
I recognize that.
Yeah.
So I would have preferred to have easier access, quite frankly, but it doesn't take away from the fact that I needed that and I don't have anybody.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just to emphasize, and I'm really glad that you found something that helped you. When I was saying that I am totally in favor in a bunch of different experiments and ways of doing things, the thing that I'm most resistant to is the hegemonic norming of the medical model as anything else is irresponsible. That is my problem. I'm trying to kind of keep the Overton window shifted to be like, hey, there's other ways of doing things that are actually, for some people, probably better in their specific cases. But I'm totally open to the possibility that some people need or would really benefit from more intensive psychological support, and people who are boomers and they just are nervous about getting involved and feeling like they want that kind of, authority figure, medical advice. I'm not trying to, question people's right to say what works for them. I just want to make it clear that there are a number of different approaches, and we shouldn't be norming the medical model as the only responsible way.
And I want to just piggyback on that, is that my kind of overall philosophical approach or thinking on this is so much of the advancement of psychedelics in recent years has been in a response to the failure of big pharma as a system. Right? And if we're replacing a broken system with another system rooted in capitalism, specifically late-stage capitalism, then we've missed the entire point.
Yeah, and part of why I call out the medical approach in terms of the powerful organizations in the field right now is because I have seen how they respond when there are rapes, when there are red flags, when there are opportunities to make a play for more money without any kind of justification behind it. And so I would feel more comfortable with the medical approach if its leaders behaved in a more responsible way. That's part of my concern, is the systems that we're rushing to scale medically are containing a lot of harmful approaches, willingness to look the other way, acceptable sacrifices, writing people who have bad experiences off as, oh, they were just borderline, they had some issue. But all the benefits, those are psychedelics that are causing those benefits. It's those things I feel like we can make a better medical system if we think more intentionally about what it is that we're doing here and why.
Yeah. think
Decriminalization.
we're in the
Decrim.
we're in we're in the process. That's I think we're in the process of. It's like the community building is now, like the culture building is now, and it takes leadership. It now takes, you're now an important part of the process of bridging the gap, and we all are in this room. It's like, so we are in that process now. It's coming. It was underground. It was small, communities that didn't want to even show their face. And now rapidly it's becoming mass. So, I think that we're all in that process together now of what does the cultural model look like, and how can we all co-create that cultural model in a way that bridges the gap.
And I think part of that is also not just protecting privileged communities, but getting away from psychedelic exceptionalism, like safe supply. Right now, there's people dying all over, not because just of fentanyl or tranks now being added to drugs everywhere. They're unintentional poisonings that people are accepting because of the stigma associated with marginalized communities and people who use drugs. And I think that part of showing up and closing these gaps is insisting that this isn't just about psychedelics, and we need to make a push for safe access and to get rid of poisonings across the board.
So we are out of time here. I know some of us would be very happy to meet at the back here. What's that?
Wonk, wonk, wonk.
Yeah, sorry. We would be happy to continue the conversation over here, but I have to wrap the panel up. I think that we have elucidated the central conversation, the central struggle here. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
For the panel.